computational science and engineering. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Professor Dion Vlachos. He's a professor in the chemical and biomolecular engineering and also a professor of physics at the University of Delaware. He's currently the director of the University of Delaware Energy Institute and also the Catalysis Center for Energy Innovation. He's a recipient of a number of awards. I just mentioned here the Willem Award in Chemical Reaction Engineering, and also he's a fellow of the American Association of Advancement of Science. Today, Dion is going to tell us how data science and multiscale modeling can be used to overcome challenges in chemical engineering sciences. So, Dion, floor is yours.
Nicolas, thank you so much, and for the nice introduction and also the opportunity, to address, computational group at MIT. So what I thought to do, let me stop a little bit in my video just to make sure that the connection is better. What I was thinking to do is to discuss about mostly how we think about data science in the multi-scale modeling arena. And let's see, okay. So the area of interest to us is catalysis, more broadly, process intensification in the chemical industry. So we can actually design better processes, less energy intensive, with less carbon dioxide emissions. At the core of chemical industry is catalysis, and 80% of the chemicals we are making today actually are made through catalysis. This has been traditionally an empirical field. We have been making materials known as catalysts. We do one thing at a time. We used to do that and see how well they behave. Now, about the 90s, high throughput experimentation came about in catalysis. And the idea was to actually optimize primarily catalyst composition by using multiple components together, and then again test them probably in high throughput, so we can actually discover things better. This has worked to an extent, and I say to an extent because catalysts actually have kind of emergent, or we may call weird behavior. I'll show you an example later on. So you can actually optimize the composition of materials in nearby space. In terms of kinetics, which describe the rate of transformations, we have been fitting experimental data to what we call power law kinetics, simple rate expressions. And then you try to use this away from the area you did the fitting to be able to optimize processes now, right? Fundamental science, of course, we're lacking with that. And computational fluid dynamics has actually emerged about the 90s as a fairly high fidelity, high accuracy kind of tool to be able to design reactors. In the CFD, there are something like constitutive equations, like heat and mass transfer, which describe the rates, not of the reactions, but of transport. And this has been still quite empirical because these are actually multi-phase, multi-scale problems. So this still remains to be high fidelity in the fluid mechanics, but when it comes down to transport, still a lot of empiricism being used. Now, the last Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you again now.
Yeah. The last 20 years have experienced, significant advances in quantum mechanical methods for condensed matter, like, solid materials. In particular, density fractional theory. So we can do calculations on absorption. We can do calculations on frequencies, which basically relate to spectroscopies, and even, on activation energies, which start now actually putting together with statistical mechanics, we can describe reaction rate constants. And so we can calculate the reactions. We can put this into detailed kinetic models. Some of the colleagues, there at MIT, like, Bill Green, has been doing, and others have been doing, pioneering work on combustion, pyrolysis, chemists for gas phase. This is much harder to do for surface catalytic, reactions. But we're at the point we actually start putting this together and start comparing to experimental data. So here is a graph on the right, shows, ethanol steam reforming. This is for hydrogen production for fuel cells. You can see the lines are model calculations we compute all the parameters through quantum mechanics, statistical mechanics, we put them in a kinetic model, we compare to the experimental points. This is the conversion of ethanol, and then some of the products. I'm getting back to this picture, but can start actually predicting those things. However, what we have done until now, for the most part, is the science we have done is more interpretive, in the sense that we have been able to explain maybe experimental data, compared to experimental data, but we are actually at the point we start thinking, well, can we convert this into predictive science? Can we actually start making predictions? And I'm interested in making predictions because I want to discover new catalytic materials, better ones. I want to discover new molecules, and this is very important in the pharma industry, but it's also very important also in the energy space we are working in. For example, discovering new electrolytes, new energy storage materials, right? So the discovery is actually extremely important. To be able to do that, I need to make sure that my models are actually quite accurate. So uncertainty quantification, errors, and how these errors propagate in multiscale models is very, very important. And in this context, actually, the work is just about starting. As engineers, we have been thinking a lot in the design and optimization. Typically, in chemical engineering, you have been thinking about process optimization. You give me a process, I try to optimize, size it, and make it better. But optimizing materials at the atomic level is something fairly new. And I want also to start thinking how to optimize the experiment so I can get maximum information out by doing a suitable design. So in this space, I'm interested in bringing artificial intelligence, data science type of techniques, so I can actually bring another kind of pillar into the modeling. And because we're engineers, we want to understand what exactly to control. I want to be able to explain things. I want to be able actually to find ways to correct models, and also to be trustworthiness, so I can actually trust the models and I can predict with quite high reliability. So these are kind of the big picture, our ultimate, if you like, goal of what we like to be able to do. So in the remaining of the talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the grand challenges in brief of first principles or multi-scale modeling. And then we'll talk about 3 topics depending on time. We'll talk about errors and corrections in the chemistry, the molecules, the reaction networks, how to quantify the errors, how to correct them. Then this is, we'll talk about another type of error, which comes really from the materials representation on the computer. Then I'm going to go back into a little bit more challenging topic, which is how do we handle non-parametric errors in the models in an attempt to actually make the models more accurate and more predictive. Okay. So in the catalysis reaction engineering field, the last 20 years, we have been making new materials and with more tailor-made, the last few years, kind of structure. We have operando now spectroscopies to characterize the materials. We have been building multiscale modeling, looking toward process specification, but AI is kind of a new tool that we try to bring in to enable the further advances. So let me start with some of the challenges. Okay, the first problem you have when you deal with chemical sciences is often the problems are actually multi-scale. You go from the reactor at the meter length scale all the way down to nanometer particles you see here in the micrograph. And if you look at each one of them, they have multiple facets and edges and corners. This is an example of a cartoon of a bimetallic nickel cluster on a platinum structure. But you see that I have a lot of interesting information of the structure. So the chemistry, the bonds are made and are broken at this sub-nanometer scale, and I need to bring all this information all the way up to the reactor scale. A major challenge is the reactor itself controls basically the chemical potential, controls the temperature and the flow, and so affects really what is coming down to this catalyst and the chemical reaction rates. So one of the challenges of these multi-scale problems is that the length and time scales are all strongly coupled. And that makes these problems inherently much more challenging. So over the last 20 years, you can see some of the review papers we published earlier on in the 2000s. Multi-scale methods were developed in our group and other groups with the idea of taking information all the way from the quantum to the macroscopic. And in reverse, starting with the performance of the macroscopic process, we like to identify the properties of materials and the materials themselves that give us the high performance, right? We developed a lot of algorithms, a lot of mathematics, how to actually link scales. And Nicholas actually is a user of people who have been involved at MIT with this kind of approaches. And I think wonderful, advances were made. The challenge, is that, for the most part, at least in the catalysis reaction engineer, you have solved problems which are kind of simple. So this cartoon, actually, we wrote a perspective just a few years ago, summarizing most of the techniques that have been put together for multi-scale problems. And if you look really from a distance, you ask what problems have we been able to solve is mostly prototype type of model, simple, single crystals, one nanoparticle. And part of the problem is that these systems are our systems are inherently complex. And so they are not easily amenable just to mathematical analysis. We need something more to solve real problems. So let me walk you through some of these challenges. This is an example on the right. You can see the movie of glycerol. It's a 3-carbon 3-oxygen molecule. It falls exactly here in terms of representing monomers of biomass, biopolymers, right? And if you really look at the number of species and chemical reactions, it explodes, especially because you have carbon and oxygen. This graph you see here on the right is actually connecting all the intermediates that we generate automatically. The point here is you have thousands of reactions and chemical reactions to represent. So this becomes quite challenging, knowing that you have represented the chemistry completely, knowing how to parameterize the chemistry. So this complexity in the number of parameters really exposes the challenge of density functional theory on catalyst is not at the speed today to be able to do this, right? We have to find some other ways of dealing with this kind of problems. Then if you look at the DFT, it has errors. And in this example, I'm sure you predicted the absorption energies in a zeolite versus the experimental ones for a bunch of different molecules at different levels of constructing the site, the structure of the catalyst. So you look at the black points, that's a systematic over prediction, I guess, over prediction, where we can have a value of 30 kcal and an experimental one of 60 kcal, severe at the prediction. Whereas if you look at the green now points, which is actually a 3-layer representation of the structure, fairly large one, at least we have removed the systematic errors, but there are still errors in the data, right? So the representation we have of the structure of the catalyst in the model is important. And even if we do the best possible job, we still have some scatter, some difference from the experimental data. On the right, you go back to this ethanol reforming example. I show you here ethanol as a function of the ethoxy, where you remove just one hydrogen. If you look at this data that we compute on different catalysts or with different fractionals, we get similar behavior. You notice, first of all, we have 6, 8, 10 points, very small data set, not a very big one. And then the data fall almost on a straight line, not a perfect line, which indicates there are actually very strong correlations in the data. And you ask the question, what is the role of these correlations in predictions, and how do I account for these correlations in predictions? Are these correlations even important? But if you go to all engineering, there are a lot of correlations of heat and mass transfer, the Chilton-Corbin analogy is an example. There are correlations all over in engineering disciplines. And we ask the question, how important is when we actually do modeling? So I'll show you this example here on. Here's an amplified version. We predict methane we have from the cracking of the 2 carbons. We predict formaldehyde, which comes from the dehydrogenation of ethanol. All of this looks very good. But if you look at the CO in black and the CO2 in this orange, the points really, there are no lines to find because they are in here or down there. So what we typically do, we find the important parameters to sensitivity analysis, we do some regression, and then we say, hey, voila, we are able actually to describe the experimental data reasonably well. But this, of course, is not predictive in modeling. The current state of kinetic modeling is we are able to predict some things well, but other things not as well, and we don't know why even the model fails. So this regression is putting basically the problem under the rug instead of solving the problem. So we realize that there are errors actually coming from density functional theory, transition state theory. These are actually errors in the parameters of the model. We call parametric errors, okay? And we need to understand how to propagate this in a multiscale kinetic model, and how important these errors are, and how to reduce them. There are also some kind of more subtle or hidden errors, which have to do with I didn't account for the correct chemistry. Right? So I go to my chemist colleague, and with the tuition we write down rules, and we actually write down the chemistry. That doesn't mean I accounted for all the important chemistry. Then I have also problems related to the physics or the materials representation. I typically take platinum 111 crystallographic plane, and I pretend that this actually represents the real material in the lab. And of course, we know that it doesn't. So one important question is, how do I account for these errors? How important are these errors in terms of the physics and the chemistry? These are obviously non-parametric errors, and there are not good techniques to quantify the importance even of this, right? I cannot do a sensitivity analysis with derivative. This is not an option I have. So to amplify the materials gap, this is a single crystal. I mentioned earlier, I could do some chemistry in ultra-high vacuum. I could do spectroscopy in the lab, and I could do calculations and compare, and hopefully I can get a very good agreement. Typically, the agreement actually is quite good. But the real catalysts are complex. This is a distribution of sizes you have. That's actually known for decades that we have. We know that from microscopy. What actually is emerging now in the last few years is things are much more complex. If you look at the micrograph in this space here, it's a metallic ruthenium catalyst we use in our lab for biomass conversion. And what we see is the top 1 or 2 layers are actually expanded. And if we do quantum mechanical calculations, including oxygen, we believe this is actually a ruthenium oxide, 1 monolayer or so, sitting on a metallic ruthenium. So that's kind of the structure. It's not really metallic ruthenium we originally thought. This is a nickel platinum bimetallic catalyst. We actually take spectroscopic data, XRs, and we try to fit atomistically through some reverse Monte Carlo, for example, and try to figure out where is the nickel, where is the platinum. In the case of biomass, the nickel is more oxophilic. It's been pulled to the surface, and so you see that blue on the surface, but it's not a perfect monolayer of one thing on another. We see a lot of platinum exposed defects, and so this catalyst, actually, the structure they have is quite complex. This image on the top right is actually a fascinating one. You can see single atoms of platinum with aberration correction microscopy on a titanium nanoparticle. These actually single atoms or even dimers are impossible to see with a regular high-resolution microscope. It's only with the new techniques you can actually see. And in many cases, these kind of atoms are believed to be the most active ones, do the catalysis of the nanoparticles. So it is really the things we don't see that do the catalysis. And so that raises an issue. What is the catalyst we should put on our computer and predict performance and compare to experimental data? And this is another image of platinum metaxylate, again, 2 elements that you can see that you form actually clusters of the oxide on top of platinum, similar to the ruthenium oxide, but this is with 2 metals. And so this raises the issue, how do we really know what structure we have, and how important is this? Now, another important aspect we mentioned earlier is we want to predict new materials. The classical approach to do that is what is called the volcano curve. So what you can see here for an example chemistry is the ammonia synthesis for fertilizers. It's calculated turnover frequency, that's the rate when you put the kinetic model together. And you calculate typically with one descriptor that until now we kind of discover by hand. This work actually by the Norskov group. In the case of ammonia, nitrogen is the most strongly bound species on the catalyst. So the strength of absorption of nitrogen is the most important one. Okay? So what you can see, actually, you get this kind of mountain volcano behavior, where elements like iron and molybdenum, which bind strongly, they basically get suffocated. They don't breathe. They are blocked by nitrogen, and so they are poor catalyst. On this side, the absorption is actually weak, so the nitrogen doesn't stay on the catalyst. And so you need intermediate energies to be able to get best performance. So what they did in this earlier work, I think published in Nature Materials and Science, is they took an alloy of 2 bad catalysts and they make a composition, a mixed close to the volcano. So this is the cobalt molybdenum catalyst. They predicted this to be actually better, and they tried that in the lab, and in fact, showed better performance than ruthenium, which is kind of expensive element to use. So what basically the idea here is to use interpolation principle, right, and start predicting new compositions of matter, so we can have new materials. Now, one of the challenges here is this actually volcano comes from the correlation I mentioned earlier, because energies are actually correlated, and they have a maximum. So this basically says that in another way that we cannot predict any better materials, and the best we can do is just this maximum, right? And so we like this question: is that really true, or can we actually predict in a new materials? Let me skip all these. This is an example of the same chemistry, but in reverse. We break ammonia as a hydrogen storage medium to produce hydrogen for a fuel cell. What we look here is a single crystal of platinum, experimentally. We dose with ammonia, we heat up the crystal, and we see what is coming off. What is coming off is just noise. That is unreactive. Platinum is unreactive. Nickel is also unreactive. So if you go back to the interpolation principle, you would think if I mix nickel and platinum, this would be an unreactive catalyst. However, surprisingly, when you put a monolayer of nickel on platinum, you actually get very high activity, and the temperature where the chemistry happens actually is the lowest of any material known, which means this catalyst actually is the most active known catalyst at the single crystal at least level. So out of two inactive catalysts, I made a molecular architecture which has emergent behavior. I cannot really predict by just mixing rules, and this architecture actually is superb in terms of activity. So what we like to do is to be able to predict this catalyst. In other words, we'll overcome this volcano curve I showed you in the previous slide. That's just by using elements of the periodic table and putting them together in a particular architecture. If you put a nickel subsurface to the platinum, it still does not work. So the molecular architecture here is very, very important, right? If you look now at even larger scales of process intensification and processing, this is a microreactor from our own lab. We try to do biomass conversion. And here you can see some examples. This is confocal microscopy images on the right, CFD images on the left, of two-phase flows that we basically try to do reaction and extraction separation from the blue to the red, from the red to the green, in these colors, right? And then eventually I want to actually start designing devices. This is a microwave reactor to bring in renewable green electricity to be able to run the chemistry. This shows you a picture of the lab, and we start basically playing around with the geometry of the reactor. And one of the things you realize is that actually this is a multidimensional with 6-8 parameters to optimize, and in a non-linear fashion. So it's impossible actually to optimize these reactors by trial and error in the lab or just even CFD. So this is an example where machine learning can be very powerful in designing optimal reactors for different chemistries, right? So kind of summarize some of the challenges as I see them. We have these multi-scale, multi-physics, multi-phase problems, right? Still challenging large reaction networks to parameterize. We have errors. We don't even know the sources, or how to quantify them, how to minimize them. It's difficult in Catalysis to represent the material in a quantitative, predictive manner. Predicting new materials is not an easy thing because it's not just a composition. It interacts basically with the fluid flow and the transport and the local chemical potential. And I want to be able to use eventually to design new processes, right? And I need to have software for all of these things. So this is a number of challenges we need, we are facing in converting the model from interpretive into predictive ones. So what I'll do in the next few minutes is to give you some examples of how we address some of these problems. And I have, as I told you, 3 topics here I picked for discussion. So let's look a bit into the errors, what kind of errors we have and how we can correct errors. Okay. So this work actually was done by Jonathan Sutton with my math collaborator, Marcos Katsoulakis at UMass. So I mentioned this example earlier on and how we can actually go about, just regressing. We like not to regress, but we try to understand, how to do parametric basically analysis. And so I also mentioned about the correlations. What we have done is to basically develop an uncertainty quantification technique that accounts for the correlation, can propagate the uncertainty we have in the errors subject or to correlation. So the correlation becomes basically a constraint in the physical model as I do this. If you look at the reaction rate, which relates to the size of a process and the cost of a process, this is the median, and you can see the uncertainty I have for first principles. It can be a couple of orders of magnitude. So my ability to predict macroscopic processes, design, optimize them from first principles, I would say is very poor. I don't show you an example here, but in case of materials, I'm doing actually very, very well. But in case of process, I'm doing quite poorly. So what we like to do is understand what are the important parameters and find ways to correct them. So this is a global sensitivity analysis, and in red is the classical one, which you can see about a dozen parameters out of the 200 reactions, which are quite important. And in blue is actually the correlated global sensitivity analysis. So first thing you notice is we have fewer parameters in blue than in red. That's important because the parameters are correlated, which means less of them are actually independent. And secondly, some important parameters shown in red don't even appear in blue. And the order, this red, blue, which is kind of important, becomes much more important when I go in the correlated case. So the parameters are also changing, which is not intuitive that this happens. There are only 4 important parameters. These relate to the absorption of ethanol and hydrogen. And the first 2 dehydrogenation reactions are the most important ones. So currently, one way to actually improve the accuracy of the model is to use experimental data to basically replace the computational data. And this will give you a very good representation of the catalyst and the performance. However, there is a question why these parameters are actually not very accurate and my rate is so uncertain and what I can do about that. And I will tell you more about the errors of density functional theory and how to correct those, right? So looking at the chemistry, I'm looking at the reactions as basically graphs. And a lot of the work we do, we use graphing theory to understand chemistry, molecules, reaction networks. So you can think of a Google map, like the cities, and these actually lines, like the highways and the back roads. In chemistry, A and B, C and D can represent stable molecules or intermediates. And the thickness of these lines indicates the rate by which I'm converting one molecule to the other. So I'm going to use graph theory to basically represent chemistry. If you look at molecule though A, so this is an example I mentioned with the glycerol. And the new thing we do actually here, we use ab initio theory to compute basically rules of how A converts to B and B to C. We learn these rules and then we can generate networks based on first principles. So this way, our chemistry is actually not intuitive anymore. It's first principles based, and I can start having more accurate or predictive reaction on networks. Still, of course, the parameterization of these large networks is a challenge. So to do that, I'm going to start looking at the molecules. And the molecules themselves are actually can be thought as a graph. So this is a slab of a platinum crystal, and you can see here a dehydrogenated ether. And I'm looking at the binding of a carbon to a platinum. This is the oxygen connected to carbons. And I'm going to use the classic, in this case, Benson approach from the 70s for the gas phase. And I have basically 2 functional groups. This oxygen in red is connected to 2 carbons here. And this carbon is connected to 1 oxygen. And the new thing we have now is carbon is connected to platinum. So now I can start bringing specifics of the site of absorption or the active site of the catalyst in the graph. That's important because molecules bind on surfaces in different ways, depending on the molecule, the degree of dehydrogenation, etc. If I use a small set of DFT numbers for the thermochemistry, like the heat of formation, the free energy, this is the enthalpy of formation, I can groups. Then once I have a molecule, I can count how many groups. I have 2 of these and 1 of these. So I can then calculate, basically the enthalpy of formation of the species. And if I compare to DFT, I see that I'm very close. I have a little additional error because of the linearization that I made in representing the molecule through graphs, right? But this allows actually to transfer the knowledge in a scalable way, because large molecules actually consist of a few small graphs, and I can actually represent very large molecules, very large networks in ultra fast computer time. So what I showed you so far is how we can identify important descriptors or graphs using a manual way, the way Besson did it in the 70s. And have been asking the question whether we can do any better. So here we actually are going to use a enumeration of the computer. We represent single atoms, for example, of hydrogen or carbon. We're going to present, dimers, trimers, and we're going to let the computer generate all possible kind of graphs. And then we're going to use lasso, a simple machine learning technique, to select these graphs for us by penalizing overfitting and optimizing the accuracy. So this is kind of the result you see at the end. This is the graphing theory with a mean error of 5K cal. This is not very large, but when you exponentiate that number, it becomes actually, the error becomes huge. And if I start accounting more for the physics, in this case, my expert knowledge of how the molecule binds on the catalyst, what kind of bonds bind on the catalyst, and then I use lasso, I can reduce this error from 5 to 2K cal per mole, which is profound actually improvement in accuracy. Still, this error is large. We like to get it down to below 1K cal per mole if possible, right? But you can see how my expert knowledge, physics, together with machine learning approaches, start actually bringing automation, unsupervised selection of descriptors, and more accuracy in the process. I'm going to be able to next quantify the errors I have in these molecules. I'm going to use graph theory again. So this is a cartoon here to see the molecule, carbon connects to hydrogen and one nitrogen. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to find which groups are responsible for the error of densification theory, okay? And I'm going to do this in gas phase molecules because I have high-level ab initio theory to use, or I can use NIST data that is fairly accurate from experiments or high-level ab initio theory. So what I'm doing, I'm going to find basically the graphs which are important, and I'm going to assign an error to the graph besides assigning a value for the chemistry, thermochemistry that I showed you in the previous slides. So this is an example of the LDA. This is a particular method of densification theory. This is BPE. This is another high level of densification theory. If you look at these dark points, is the prediction for gas phase molecules. You can see very large errors and systematic actually errors in comparison to the parity line. Now, if I actually correct these errors, I get to these cyan or the red points, which shows that the error actually is significantly reduced. And so this actually shows you a promise to be able to reduce the error of DFT. Again, graph theory, which is linear in nature, is actually fairly simple and powerful to be able to reduce errors. Here is another example. We use exactly the same idea, but we use a high-level theory and a low-level DFT theory to merge data sets. And I do this fusion by identifying again the difference in the values between important groups. And in this case, we can actually get down to an error of about 1K cal per mole, which is actually very, very good. It's the best we can actually expect to get. We can also identify important groups. So what you see here, if I go maybe skipping on here, what you see is the single atoms are the most important ones in terms of the error in the DFT. You see some bonds, carbon, nitrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, carbon being also important, but are also non-intuitively some longer range effects, larger groups that bring error to the simulation. But only with 10 to 80 kind of groups, I can actually predict errors and correct errors. And that's very powerful instead of having too many of them. If I go back, we try to understand why this idea actually works. Again, we are in the gas phase. We train with a few thousand molecules. And here we do a projection in the two principal components. Basically, we look at the similarity of the graphs and the frequency of these graphs in the molecules. And we actually project in the first two principal components to figure out how similar these molecules are. It's one way of doing similarity of molecules. Here you see actually one of the big databases, the Q9, that we project the same way. And what you can see is visually, these graphs look very, very similar, right? And so what it means is even though we have a lot of large organic molecules, including pharmaceuticals, the fundamental graphs in these molecules are just a few. And simply the large molecules are linear combinations of these graphs. So our ability to do graph theory to start and correcting errors fundamentally lies exactly in this property that there are not as many rare groups. On the right bottom, you see actually some of these rare groups that are actually primarily some cyclic, compounds that are not as many in the large database. And these ones, basically, we cannot predict, very well. They are outliers, if you like. But they're also dissimilar. They're actually far away from where the rest of the molecules are. So this similarity approach can be used as a diagnostic tool to tell us if a new molecule, is actually falls in this space or not, and whether we can predict it accurately or not, right? So we talk a little bit about errors and some first approach to start correcting the errors. Let me tell you a little bit about the materials gap. As I mentioned earlier, this is actually it brings the issue of the microstructure of the catalyst, right? And our ability to know what that thing is, how to model it. So this is some DFT kinetic Monte Carlo calculations, which again calculate the rate as we change the yellow and the blue. So the amount of the yellow can change, or we can arrange the yellow in different ways on the blue. So if you take at the quarter monolayer, 25% of nickel as an example, on blue platinum, you can see the rate can change by 2 orders of magnitude, right? Profound effect. So the microstructure, when I also show you the nickel platinum for the ammonia chemistry, it is super important. And so we have actually been spending a lot of time to understand how to engineer that, how to find optimal structures, and how to actually put better structures on the computer. So a fundamental question, how do we do this? So this is where we're going to actually start looking at the operando spectroscopy as an approach to identify the structure on the computer from experimental data. So here is the idea. What I'm showing you here is the vibration of oxygen on a metal as a function of the vibration of nitrogen on a surface. These are actually experimental data on the left, and you can see almost a perfect straight line, which indicates there are actually correlations not only for energies, but also for frequencies. And if you think of Hooke's law, energy and frequency are actually correlated with the square root. So maybe this is not as surprising, but it's interesting to compile experimental data and see this correlation. We actually did, deep band theory, and we predicted the slope of these lines. And here are actually multiple slopes or multiple lines as the ones you see on the left from density functional theory now data. You see our prediction and the DFT fits actually are very much in a parity line, which means we understand basically these correlations, okay? What's even more, I think, exciting is to put, a probe like a carbon monoxide on a surface. This probe can absorb between atoms, like a hollow site, as shown here in the cartoon. It can be on top of a metal, between two metals, called a bridge, or a hollow, as I show you here in this cartoon. If you look at the frequency, experimental one, it changes significantly from one side to the other. In other words, this vibrational frequency of the carbon with the metal and also the carbon with oxygen changes is very, very sensitive signature of the structure. And on the right, actually, we found some experimental data that correlate this wave number as a function of the coordination number. The coordination number is basically tells you the number of bonds of platinum, or tells you the crystallographic plane. You can see actually a very good correlation. Now, these are just a limited number of data, but when you go and do DFT on number of nanoparticles, and you put the carbon monoxide on multiple sides of a nanoparticle and other nanoparticles, a lot of them, you can actually start drawing now correlations about the CO frequency, okay, as a function of the coordination number. And you can see again a beautiful correlation, which indicates that I can start actually getting an idea about the crystallographic plane, and even more so about the site on every plane where the CO actually binds. So the way we do this, if we are going to use a training data set from DFT, we are going to convert in this frequency actually into spectra, shown here in brown, okay, with a little bit of theory. We are going to compare to experimental data shown, for example, in blue. You can see that we get very good agreement with the experiments. Now, the intensity of these peaks that we predict here is important because the area under that tells us really the number of sites, not just the sites. So the peaks, the frequencies tell us about the plane and the site, but the areas under tell us about how many of each one of the sites we have. So here you see actually after a few thousands of the spectra we generate on the computer, we actually create synthetic data, which does a convolution of the spectra, okay? And then I use basically two neural nets one for the type of site, and one for the plane, and I can actually start getting basically back structures. So in this piece here, we actually do the inverse modeling, right? We forward DFT data to predict spectra, we learn the spectra, and then given experimental spectra, predict basically the structure. And so we have done some validation, which I'm going to skip here, so that this actually framework works. And basically summarize here, what I told you is we start thinking how to actually use spectroscopy, experimental data spectra in particular, which are very, very informative of structure, and through machine learning and DFT, start basically identifying what the structure is. So you can put the structure now properly on the computer to start doing more predictive modeling. One of the open questions here, I'd like to spend just 2-3 minutes, is getting back to this non-parametric error. How do we really quantify how much error we have when we don't deal with physical parameters? And so we actually, with 2 of our graduate students and my math collaborator, we started actually building a framework of AI, which is explainable and correctable. And the way we do that is basically through PGMs, probabilistic graph models. This is actually a part of Bayesian networks. And the paper was just published just a few weeks ago. So I'm going to show you through an example. We're looking here at what is called the ORR reaction. This is the oxygen reduction reaction. It's one important reaction in fuel cells. And the reaction network actually is fairly simple in this case. 2 of the reactions actually are the most important. Reaction 1, which is the activation of oxygen to form this hydroperoxy species. And these reactions typically can be slow. And the second reaction is this reaction R4, where removing the hydroxyl and convert that to water can be also slow because hydroxy binds too strongly on the catalyst. So it is competition between these 2 reactions that gives basically rise to the catalyst performance. This is DFT points in red and blue. I'm calculating the free energies of the 2 reactions, 1 and 4, very easy from the hydroperoxy and the hydroxyl binding energies, which I get out of DFT. So these are the DFT points for the 2 reactions, delta G1, delta G4. So the lowest of these 2 basically free energies will determine the reaction rate, which is here the Norskov model. And so you actually create an envelope where the free energy, the lowest free energy, this solid line, the red, and the solid blue, create a volcano curve. And what you like is a material has about this free energy for oxygen, that's optimum material, and that's the best rate you can get. Again, using the concept of the volcano curve, which as we discussed, has some limitations. On the right, you actually see a graph that actually developed. I have also arrows to indicate, in this case, not correlation, but actually causality. What actually variable actually causes what other variable, and explains basically how I go and calculate from the interception of these 2 lines, these 2 basically values, right? Now, in a probabilistic sense, I have to bring the errors in, and so what you see here is the same basically graph, but I bring errors, and the errors can come from solvation, whether I include solvation or not, how I model the solvation in the model of the electrolyte, error from the experimental data, how reliable are the data I'm comparing to, error from the density fractional theory, or error from the correlations. Basically, these correlations in the data that I mentioned earlier are important. These probability distribution functions you see here describe DFT-based data. And you can see the histograms, which is the actual data. And you can see also normal distributions, which are not very good representations, but they can define a simple model to start doing mathematical analysis. If I want to do more accurate model, I can start sampling directly from the histogram itself, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to propagate basically error from the different sources in the different variables and eventually in the quantities of interest. One of the things Marcos did with the student is actually predicting guarantees. And to our knowledge, it's the first time actually one can predict upper and lower bounds of uncertainty in an AI model. So in the volcano curve, you see the upper bound and the lower bound of the reaction rate, right? Another important thing I can do, I can actually start quantifying the error that I bring into the model from different sources. And these now are non-parametric. And so I can quantify basically different physical models I'm missing a piece of the chemistry, I'm missing a piece of the physics into the model. So this is the last slide I have in here. I'm looking at two quantities of interest. This is the logarithm of the rate, is one quantity of interest. The other one is the optimum materials property, so I can discover new materials. You can see the error from the different sources. This is the DFT error here in blue, here again in blue. In red is the solvation error. What I want you to take from this slide is two things. Number one is, depending on the quantity of interest, the most important variables, parameters, actually are different. Solvation energy, as an example, is critical if I want to predict the reaction rate. However, when you look at the solvation energy, the solvation models, in predicting materials, it doesn't really matter as much. Okay? DFT in both quantities of interest is more important. And if I focus on materials prediction, DFT and the correlations are the most important quantities that I need to understand and I need to optimize. So DFT, of course, we talked a bit about the errors and first attempts in diminishing the errors of DFT. And definitely, as you see, DFT is something we need to do better. And I think this error is one approach to reducing DFT error that we should exploit more. In the next slide, I'm showing you how we can actually deal with correlations. So I showed you previously this volcano curve with just a few data points on the right here, typically because these weakly absorbing materials are actually very few on the periodic table: gold, copper, silver. What we have done is to use bimetallics like gold or iridium that we know from expert knowledge have very weak binding. So what we have done is enhance the data set on the right, so I can actually get more accurate correlation for the blue line and more accurate, of course, intersection between the red and the blue. So when we do this, if you look as an example in the reaction rate, the log of the rate, we actually have a significant reduction by a factor of 2 in the uncertainty. Okay, and this is the log, so you can imagine that this is actually much more accurate rate, and I'm actually reducing by about a third the materials properties by going from this baseline model with few data points to more data points. Now, what I can go in the lab and ask my experimental colleagues or myself to actually do experiments with this kind of materials, so I can get even experimentally more data points, not just DFT. But this shows you a way of correcting the model by knowing what's important through the approach I just mentioned. So let me close here. As I mentioned earlier on, we are working on problems of energy sustainability. A new discovery of new materials, new molecules, new processes is extremely important. And it's new innovation quite a lot. Obviously, models are extremely important. These are inherently multi-scale, multi-physics, multi-phase models. We like to convert them for more interpretation into more prediction. And to do that, I discussed a lot today about how we start going about errors, how to actually reduce errors so we can have better models. So let me thank the students who actually did the work, Marcos and the funding, and thank you very much for your attention.
Dion, thank you very much for a very nice talk. We have time for a few questions.
So, Dion, I have one quick question to start. On the last work you showed where you derived these bounds on the uncertainty, I think this uses some of these formulations that Marcos has worked on. What ingredients do you need from the modeling perspective to be able to derive these kinds of bounds? Kind of maybe both mathematically, but also kind of from the chemical modeling perspective, like what do you need to feed into it to be able to get these?
So these are not very difficult quantities to compute. They are easy to compute. We need basically properties, parameters coming into the model, and aspects about the solvation model. So we basically went back to say, okay, how do we estimate solvation? What are typical models? And we start understanding what is the prediction and the error these models have and how they compare to experimental data. So it's exactly this information of the models that we need. It's not computationally, it's very tractable to compute these bounds. Right? And I think what's important is give us kind of worst case scenario, including potentially rare events. Now, again, this is the first paper that we have done. We need to explore how well this works, also with experimental data, right? It's also one specific example we took here. The method mathematical is general, but how easy it is to compute this for other things, other physical systems. So this is early work, but the mathematics actually is rigorous and is general, which is great. Give us confidence that this can be done, right? That's exciting part.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the formulation is super nice. I've seen this.
So Marcos, I was just talking to him over the weekend. He has the mathematical now proofs in more detail, the math part in a paper ready. So that the mathematical foundation of that, we have some of that stuff, more algorithmic aspects in the supplement, but more mathematical aspects could be of interest maybe to you, are actually forthcoming. He can give you a preprint of what he does.
Thanks.
Any other questions? There's one question in the chat. What challenges do you face more designing multiscale products? Energy conversion. I'm not quite sure what it means. Perhaps it means which is more challenging, or where the challenges lie.
Yeah, so if we want to look at the energy conversion, like fuel cells, energy storage, chemical transformations, I think there are challenges at the process scale and challenges at the material scale, right? The two extremes. We want to have better materials, we can do more efficient transformations, but we also want to design the process. Because of the CFD, having enough computer power, you can do actually a number of calculations. You can actually design processes. I think this is much more straightforward. Yeah, sure, it's a multi-objective optimization often. It has multiple variables, it has constraints, the usual things of optimization. But with machine learning developing surrogate models, I think this is much more straightforward, the processing. I mean, this is a challenge, but I think it's much more straightforward. I think the materials prediction is actually more difficult. It's much more challenging because you have multiple chemical species. They have this emergent behavior, right, that you don't know about. So this is much more difficult not to be able to predict. I think what is even more interesting and fun is to combine optimization of materials and process at the same time, right? And this is not even much more difficult, challenging. Chris Fludas did before he passed away, some initial work along these lines, bringing basically full systems and materials together, but there's not much work, and this is very difficult to do. I think it's not the process that is the most challenging. It's the materials and process together is definitely the most challenging work to be done in the future.
Okay. So if you could say a few words about this idea of reducing the error of quantum calculations by bringing in extra information. I mean, that's very exciting because presumably this costs less than working on the DFT calculations themselves. The question is, what if there is incompatibility between these two models and they are pulling in different directions? How can you reconcile that, or what is the best you can expect out of approaches like that?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. We have been thinking about this problem. You get also experimental data, computational data. You try to compare, you get a beautiful parity graph, but then 5 data points are way off, right? So there are differences between computational methods, between computation experiments for some of the data. So there is a question, how do we reconcile these differences, right? I don't think this is a solved problem, but I can give you some thoughts. It can be the experimental data is wrong, right? It is possible. We have actually seen calibration and other things in our own lab often being the problem rather than the computations. It can be that the density functional theory makes most of the error for this particular molecule for some reason, right? And that's not clear. when we try to discover materials, these outliers, when we were graduate students, all of us, the faculty, we used to do hypothesis testing and throw away these outliers. I think we should not do that because these outliers can be the exotic materials that do just the right chemistry. So this reconciliation of the data is extremely important. I don't think we have exactly systematic ways. We can have, like the similarity metric or similarity metrics as criteria to basically flag this data. This is easy. Once we flag this data that is different, there's a question of why, right? And one has to go a little bit maybe back into testing functional theory, different methods. What is inherent in the method that is making this prediction? You can compare the DFT to experimental data, but this is something that needs human expert knowledge, the way I feel at the moment, to figure out what's wrong with this data. I don't think we have systematic ways of correcting or figuring out automatically what the source of the difference is, where it's coming from. I think for the most part, we can start correcting the DFT error by proving the DFT itself or finding corrections to DFT. Sure, we can do this, but then we get outliers. That's actually hard to deal with. So we have actually some projects working on these ideas. And I think a lot of things can be done, but it's not, I wouldn't say at the moment, as far as I know, have anything ourselves in our group or other groups systematic of how to close this gap, right? Things are looking not different, they are weird, but we don't know why. This is kind of difficult at the moment to handle. I think this is very exciting and important. But data sets, when we bring them together, there are going to be issues. It can be a typo, as simple as this, right? To anything you can imagine, but you don't know if it's a typo. You need to start going back and trace. It's like COVID tracing. We have to go back and trace where the problem is coming from. And it can come from multiple sources again, and we need to identify what are these things. It can be multiple things, not just one, at the same time. So I think this is exciting and challenging.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for our speaker? Yes, that's it. Looks like you're off the hook. Thank you very, very much for a very nice presentation.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you.
And I hope next time we can do it in person.
We'll do it in person. Hope to see you soon.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.